Welcome to Rethinking Communication. I'm your host, Michael Ashford. Come with me on a journey as I explore how we better connect with each other through the power of our words. For most of us, formal education left gaps in our ability to communicate well with each other, especially when trying to navigate conflict, inspire change, and overcome misunderstandings. I'm a former journalist, a speaking coach, and a communication expert, and my goal is to encourage you to rethink what it means to be an effective communicator, from the stage to the meeting room to the living room and everywhere in between. Welcome back to part 5 of my 6-part series on the communication skills to improve in the age of AI. We're almost through it here. I hope this has been enjoyable for you. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Email me at michael@rethinkingcommunication.com if you've got thoughts on how this series has perhaps opened your eyes a little bit or made you think differently about communication. That's certainly my goal, but I'd love to hear from you. What's it been like? And if you have any questions about anything I've covered so far, we're almost at the end here. Just today's episode plus one more next week, and I'll be closing out this series. Like I said, hope it's been helpful, informative for you, and I'm excited about it. I've really enjoyed putting these together. If you or someone you know wants help, one-on-one help with your communication skills and growing these skills and many more like it as a communicator, as a leader, then jump over to my website and check out my coaching offerings. I've helped hundreds of speakers, leaders, executive teams, leadership teams overcome the challenges many of us have when it comes to communicating well. As I always say, most of us were not taught through our formal education how to communicate well. Our formal education failed us in many ways, and I'm here to bridge that gap. So if you're thinking, hey, being a better communicator could help me grow in my career, or it could help increase my influence at work, or it could put me on that stage that I've always wanted to be on, reach out, let's chat. Go to my website again, michaelashford.com. The link is in the show notes, and let's just have a conversation and let's see if there's a fit there. All right, this is part 5 of this 6-part series. Last week, talked about staying present and observant. Here in this episode, going to talk about pausing before you respond. So let's get into it. Recently, I was challenged at work by an employee. Now, when I say challenged, it was a calling out of sorts. An employee of mine called out some behavior that I had exhibited that, in all honesty, he was absolutely right to call me out. You know, in my role as a senior director of marketing at a software company and having led teams for 15 plus years now, you can settle into some habits, or with everything that you have to think about, stuff can get lost. Or if you aren't diligent in paying attention to the things that need to be said, when they need to be said, at the appropriate times, acknowledging the right people at the right times, it can create some difficulties for people. And this is exactly what happened here. Long story short, I was sharing with the entire company a project that had been done, and I didn't give a full explanation and due credit to the people that had done the work. And that's what I got called out on. Now, when I first read that Slack message, calling me out and asking me the questions like, hey, are we not as important here? The natural human response came up in me, which was I immediately got defensive. I didn't say anything, but I immediately got defensive in my mind. Like my pulse quickened a little bit. I started saying, internally, well, if you only knew, or, well, I didn't mean that. You should have known that. I didn't mean, those were the thoughts and the feelings that were coming up in my brain, in my mind. And I was having, in some ways, a physical reaction to it. Like I said, pulse quickened, body tensed up. And I got a little defensive. I got a little angry, for sure. I will admit that. But here's what I want to share with you today. As I mentioned earlier, I did not immediately respond. I took in the criticism. I read it. I had that initial guttural, instinctive response within myself, but I did not respond. And I knew that I should not in that moment. Now, this is years of me practicing this ability coming through here, but this is exactly the point of part 5 here, the skill that you must build. In those moments where you feel compelled to immediately respond, perhaps don't. Think about what an immediate response would garner, what it would accomplish, and ask, does this require an immediate response, or can I put some thought into what my response will be here? This is absolutely a skill that can be learned, and it's really, really difficult. But there's a quote out there that encapsulates the idea that I'm trying to get across to you today. It's often attributed to a Holocaust survivor, Viktor Frankl, who later became a psychiatrist. I don't know that it necessarily is Viktor Frankl's quote. There's some ambiguity there, but the quote still remains ever powerful. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. This quote strikes at the core of this skill. You do have the choice to pause before you respond. And in that pause, you create within yourself better communication skills. You create within yourself a better way to show up communicatively. Now let's go back to the example that I was telling you about with the employee who called me out. Instead of immediately responding, I stepped away from my desk, away from my computer, and I started to think through everything that this employee had brought to me, had surfaced, and I started to think, is he correct? Is he right? Could I have done something better? What's my perspective? How could it have come off to him and to others within the company? And here's the major question that I believe I've talked about here on this podcast before. In that space between stimulus and response, one of my favorite questions to ask is, what could I be missing? My two favorite questions to ask in that space are, what is my goal and what could I be missing? But in this particular instance, I really, truly asked myself, what could I be missing? And when I asked myself and was honest with the answer, the feedback that I was getting, even though I didn't appreciate it in the moment, having that mirror held up in front of me, what I was missing was, from his perspective, it was true. I failed as a leader in that space to prop others up, to give others their just due, their just credit, their just flowers, so to speak, and instead hogged all of that for myself. And when I took that step back and asked, what could I be missing? That became clear to me. And so when I eventually did respond to that employee who called me out, when we had a conversation, not a back and forth on Slack, not text messages, not email exchanges, but an actual real conversation, face to face. Well, it was Zoom, but it's as close to face to face as you can get these days digitally in a lot of ways. When I actually had that conversation, it was so much more meaningful. I could share not only my perspective, but I could share the empathy response that had come up when I asked myself that question in that space between stimulus and response. And I could commit to changing behavior. I could commit to not just apologizing for the action, for the misstep on my part, but I could actually come to the table with a solution. That it wasn't just headbutting back and forth, that I didn't take offense at the fact that a mirror was held up to my behavior, but we could actually have a solution-focused conversation. And so many times when we are challenged, when there is conflict, when there is change that needs to happen, we're often having an argument or having a disagreement about the fact that we disagree rather than what we're actually disagreeing about or what the conflict actually happens to be in that moment. And there's a major difference between how you show up communicatively in those two spaces. Are you having an argument for argument's sake, where really nothing is going to be accomplished other than finger pointing and both sides leaving the conversation, so to speak, having felt that they won or needed to gain a victory over the other? Or are you having a solution-oriented conversation? Going back to that quote, within that response that exists in that space lies our growth and freedom. We are free then to consider other possibilities. We are free to get out of our echo chamber and consider there may be a viewpoint here that I have been missing. And in that lies growth. That lies growth in your career, your ability to connect with people who disagree with you, your ability to affect change. But these days, it does absolutely feel like an almost insurmountable task because you feel so much pressure to respond immediately. Certainly at work, when conflicts arise, when change is needed to happen, the initial default is typically do it now, do it fast, get it done, let's move on. And it takes somebody who is well-grounded, somebody who makes a commitment to doing something right rather than just doing something fast, to take a pause, to take a beat and say, how do I want to respond to this situation, to this challenge, to this conflict, to this moment, to this conversation? And when you can do that, when you can put the brakes on, when you can pause and bring in dialogue, bring in and invite in back and forth conversation about the actual issue at hand, you will be seen as a better communicator, a better leader, and someone who is invested in better outcomes. And that creates real change. That creates the response that you eventually want, or that creates the closeness and relationship that you eventually want. That creates a connection between, in this instance, two people, where you can assume best intent of that person. Because most often, our initial response often does not consider best intent, or if the other person has best intent in mind. No matter the delivery vehicle or the delivery mechanism or the way that the message was delivered, our initial response was like what mine was, to being challenged like that, to get defensive, to want to point the finger back at the person and say, well, you didn't do this, or I don't like the way you're delivering this message. And again, it becomes about the argument rather than the fact that there is an issue at hand. But when we can pause, when you can pause and not respond so quickly to that initial stimulus, it invites in a level of empathy, which invites in what I talk about in my ask then see approach to conflict communication. That first A in the ask is assume positive intent. And when you can do that, the entire conversation changes. Yes, it may still be true that the delivery of the feedback or the criticism or the critique or the idea was not the best. The stimulus did heighten your senses, but we can forgive someone, or we can see how that would be the case when placed within the global framework of assuming positive intent, that people do have positive intent. It may be misinformed, misguided in some ways, not saying that was the case here with my example, but when you can lead with the assumption of positive intent, when you can do the other elements of the ask then see approach to conflict communication, which I write about in my book, Can I Ask a Question? Assume positive intent, set aside your ego, and know that you don't know everything. That's the work that happens when you can pause before you respond. And then you can enter into question asking. You can invite in curiosity into that space rather than defensiveness and being on the attack. That was the approach I used. Tell me, what happened? Where did we go wrong? What were you feeling? How did that come across? And we got to work on solutions. I'll be very open and honest here. When I realized, when I took that step back, when I paused and started going through and answering that question, what could I be missing? I came to some realizations that part of the problem that had come up, not just this time in this example, but in previous times, was I had been trying to deliver information without doing the proper pre-work needed to make sure that I covered everything that was most important to be shared. Said simply, I wasn't preparing for the meeting in the way that I should have to make sure that I was relaying the most important information and highlighting the most important elements that took place, including the people who did the work. So I committed to my employee, I'm going to do that pre-work. I'm going to do that pre-work and I'm going to change here. That was the solution that came out of this. We had a great conversation, and if he's listening right now, I think he would agree. I think he would agree that we had a great conversation and we came to some really fruitful resolution. Now, this example that I've given you, I paused for quite a while. I paused for several hours. My pause, that space between the stimulus and my response, was several hours. Not all the time do you have that kind of space to pause. You might be in the middle of a meeting and you can't take a step back or take a step away for several hours to consider your response if you've been challenged or if you've been disrespected, perhaps. But what you can do, it is completely appropriate. If you've been, for example, disrespected in a meeting, somebody has said something off color or somebody has said something that felt like a personal attack, one of the most powerful things that you can do to hold up the mirror to somebody who has been disrespectful in this example is to pause and let the weight of that disrespect hang out there for a second. Hang out there for a couple moments. It gets really uncomfortable when the person who has been slighted or disrespected lets it sit for a moment. And then, rather than their response be to go on the attack back and match disrespect with disrespect, invite in curiosity. Invite in that mirror holding element of asking a question and letting the person respond back to that question, not in a weaponized way. So the example might be if somebody says something disrespectful to you, maybe makes an offhanded or an off-color remark about, I don't know, what you're wearing that day. We'll keep it tame here. You can pause, let it sit, just for a beat. Let the weight of the disrespect hang out there for a second. And then perhaps ask the question, what did you intend with that comment? How did you intend that comment to land with me? How do you think that felt to me when you just said that right now? Almost always, that kind of question, that truly curious question, put back on them will cause a retraction. You know what? I'm so sorry. That was really inappropriate of me. I apologize. And again, I go back to that quote, largely attributed to Viktor Frankl, but it still remains true no matter who said it. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and freedom. Take a beat, slow down, pause. I promise you will show up as a more effective communicator when you do so. That's it for part 5 of this 6-part series. We got one more left, folks. One more next week. We're going to be talking about, I'm going to actually leave the topic of this one. I'm going to leave you as a cliffhanger for what part 6 will be. So come back next week for part 6 and the wrap up, the conclusion of this series. I hope it's been an enjoyable one for you. As always, go to my website, michaelashford.com, for any further information about my coaching, to sign up for my newsletter, all that good stuff. And until next time, as always, keep asking questions.